The bitter Wyoming wind cut through Eliza's thin wool coat like 1,000 needles, each gust carrying the promise of another merciless winter in the year 1870. She pressed her gloved fingers against the frost-covered window of the stagecoach, watching the landscape transform from the gentle rolling hills she'd known back east to the harsh, unforgiving terrain of the frontier. Mountains loomed in the distance like ancient sentinels, their peaks lost in gray clouds heavy with snow. The coach lurched violently, throwing her against the hard wooden seat. Outside, the driver cursed at the horses, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. Eliza clutched the worn leather satchel in her lap, all that remained of her former life in Pennsylvania. Inside, wrapped in her mother's old handkerchief, were $43 and a letter from Dr. Harrison back home. The words still burned in her memory. Without proper treatment and medicine, I fear your mother has perhaps 3 months, maybe less. 3 months. The words had echoed in her mind throughout the 2-week journey west. 3 months to earn enough money for the new treatment the doctor had read about in medical journals from Philadelphia. $300. A fortune for a seamstress's daughter. But she'd heard tales of the opportunities out west. Gold strikes, cattle drives, towns springing up overnight where a hard-working woman could earn decent wages in hotels or shops. The coach shuddered to a halt, and the driver's gruff voice called out, "Casper, Wyoming, end of the line." Eliza gathered her courage along with her meager belongings and stepped down into the muddy street. The town sprawled before her in all its raw, unvarnished glory. False-fronted buildings lined the main thoroughfare, their painted signs already peeling in the harsh weather. Saloons outnumbered everything else 3 to 1, their doors swinging constantly as men stumbled in and out. The air reeked of horse manure, whiskey, and unwashed bodies. She had expected rough conditions, but nothing had prepared her for the complete indifference in the faces of the people she passed. Men in dusty coats and wide-brimmed hats barely glanced her way, too focused on their own survival to spare attention for another Eastern newcomer. Women were scarce, and those she did see hurried along with downcast eyes, clutching their shawls tight against more than just the cold. The Frontier Hotel stood 3 stories tall, its yellow paint faded to the color of old bones. Eliza pushed through the heavy door, grateful for even the marginal warmth inside. The lobby was sparse, a few wooden chairs, a pot-bellied stove glowing red in the corner, and a desk where a thin man with pomaded hair sat reading a newspaper. "I need a room," she said, setting down her satchel with as much dignity as she could muster. "And I'm looking for employment. I'm skilled with needle and thread. And I can read and write." The clerk looked up, his eyes traveling from her mud-stained boots to her travel-worn dress. His smile was the kind that made her skin crawl. "Room's $2 a night, in advance. As for work," he leaned back, fingers drumming on the desk. "Might be some opportunities for a pretty young thing like yourself, though perhaps not the kind you're imagining." Heat rose to her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm a respectable woman seeking respectable employment. Aren't they all? At first." He slid the register toward her. $2. Take it or sleep in the snow." She counted out the money carefully, aware that each dollar spent brought her mother closer to death. The room key he handed her was attached to a wooden tag marked 12. "3rd floor," he said, already returning to his paper. "And miss? A word of advice. That Eastern respectability you're clinging to, it won't buy you a cup of coffee out here." The room was barely larger than a closet, containing a narrow bed with a straw mattress, a washstand with a cracked pitcher, and a single window that rattled in its frame. Eliza sat on the bed, springs groaning beneath her weight, and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to feel the crushing weight of her situation. When the 5 minutes passed, she rose, washed her face with the icy water from the pitcher, and pinned her dark hair into a severe bun. If the West wanted to test her resolve, she would meet it head-on. Her mother's life depended on it. The next 3 days passed in a blur of rejection and diminishing funds. The mercantile had no need for seamstresses. Most folks mended their own clothes or did without. The hotel restaurant had already hired all the serving girls they needed. Even the laundry, run by a severe German woman, turned her away with a curt, "No work." By the fourth night, Eliza sat in a room counting and recounting her remaining money. $28. The medicine alone would cost $300, plus the cost of sending it east. At $2 a night for the room, she had perhaps another week before she'd be on the street. The arithmetic was merciless. A knock at her door interrupted her desperate calculations. The clerk from downstairs stood in the hallway, that same unsettling smile playing at his lips. "Still looking for work, miss?" "Yes," she said warily, not opening the door fully. He produced a folded piece of paper from his vest pocket. "Might be you're going about it wrong. There's other kinds of employment for a woman alone. Good money, too." He held out the paper. "Address is written there. Tell them Hollis sent you." After he left, Eliza unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. The address was for somewhere called the Silver Dollar, and below it, someone had scrawled, "Young, pretty, desperate, perfect." She crumpled the paper and threw it in the corner, but as the night wore on and the wind rattled her window, she retrieved it, smoothing out the wrinkles. $28. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, singing hymns while she sewed by candlelight, never complaining even when her fingers bled from the needle. The next evening found Eliza standing outside the Silver Dollar, her best dress hidden beneath her coat, her mother's small gold cross tucked inside her collar where no one could see. The saloon was everything she'd feared, loud, smoky, filled with men whose eyes followed her the moment she entered. Girls in low-cut dresses served drinks and sat on customers' laps, their painted smiles never quite reaching their eyes. She found Hollis at a corner table, playing cards with a group of rough-looking men. "Ah, the Eastern Flower," he said, not looking up from his cards. "Boys, give us a moment." The men grumbled but dispersed, leaving Eliza standing awkwardly by the table. "Sit," Hollis commanded. When she hesitated, he laughed. "Just sit. We're talking business." She perched on the edge of a chair, back straight, hands folded in her lap. "Here's the situation," he began, shuffling the cards absently. "There's a man, lives up in the mountains, comes to town maybe twice a year, strange fellow, keeps to himself, but he's got money, real money, not dust or promises. He's made an unusual request, and he's willing to pay well for it." "What kind of request?" The words came out as barely a whisper. "One night. That's all. He wants a woman to spend one night at his cabin. No questions asked. No strings after. $300. The room seemed to spin. $300. Exactly what she needed. Exactly what her mother's life was worth. "Why so much?" she managed to ask. Hollis shrugged. Who knows what goes on in a man's mind when he's been alone too long? Maybe he just wants company. Maybe he wants more, but he pays in advance, and he's never hurt anyone. That's more than you can say for most men in this town. I need time to think." "No time, sweetheart. He's leaving tomorrow at dawn. It's tonight or never." He leaned forward. "Look, I'll be straight with you. You're not the first desperate woman to come through here, and you won't be the last. But this is real money for one night's work. After that, you can go back east, play the respectable lady, and no one needs to know." Eliza stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I need air." Outside, she leaned against the rough wooden wall of the saloon, gasping in the cold night air. Snow had begun to fall, soft flakes that melted as soon as they touched her burning cheeks. $300. One night, her mother's life hanging in the balance. She thought of all the prayers she'd whispered on the journey west, all the promises she'd made to return with money for the cure. She thought of her mother's gentle hands, now too weak to hold a needle, of the pride in her mother's eyes when she'd taught Eliza to read and write, insisting that education would be her path to a better life. What would her mother think if she knew what her daughter was contemplating? But then another voice, colder and more practical, whispered, "What good is pride if your mother dies? What comfort is respectability if you have to wire home that you've failed?" Before she could lose her nerve, Eliza walked back into the saloon. Hollis looked up, reading the answer in her face before she spoke. "When?" was all she said. "Midnight, behind the livery stable. He'll have a horse for you." He counted out $50 from his wallet. "This is from him, for your trouble. The rest when you reach his cabin." She took the money with numb fingers. It felt heavier than it should, as if each bill carried the weight of her shame. The hours until midnight passed in a haze. Eliza sat in her room, still wearing her best dress, the blue one her mother had made for her 20th birthday. She'd pinned her hair up carefully and even applied a touch of rouge to her cheeks, though her hands shook so badly she had to wipe it off and start over twice. At 1:45, she made her way through the empty streets. The snow was falling harder now, muffling the sounds of the saloons and turning the world into something soft and unreal. Behind the livery stable, a massive figure waited beside two horses. Even in the darkness, she could make out his size, well over 6 feet, broad shoulders beneath a heavy fur coat. As she approached, he turned, and the moonlight illuminated a face that was nothing like what she'd expected. No leer, no drunken grin. Just dark eyes that seemed to look right through her, set in a face weathered by wind and sun and something else, something that looked like sorrow. "You're the girl?" His voice was deep, rumbling like distant thunder. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. He studied her for a long moment, then said quietly, "You don't have to do this." The unexpected kindness nearly broke her. She blinked back tears, lifting her chin. "Yes, I do." Something shifted in his expression, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a desperation that matched his own. Without another word, he helped her mount one of the horses, his hands gentle despite their size, as they rode out into the snowy darkness, leaving the lights of Casper behind. Eliza gripped the reins and tried not to think about what dawn would bring. The mountains loomed ahead, black against the star-filled sky, and somewhere among them waited a stranger's cabin and a bargain that would save her mother's life, or destroy her own soul in the trying. The wind picked up, driving snow into her face, but she didn't turn back. There was no turning back now. Behind her lay failure and death. Ahead lay shame and salvation. And in between, riding beside her in silence, was a man whose own reasons for this devil's bargain remained as mysterious as the mountains themselves. The snow fell heavier as they climbed higher into the mountains, and Eliza pulled her coat tighter against the biting wind. Each breath formed clouds of vapor in the frigid air, and her fingers had long since gone numb around the reins. The path, if it could be called that, wound between towering pines whose branches groaned under the weight of snow. The man riding beside her hadn't spoken since they'd left town. She'd stolen glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking, trying to reconcile this silent, careful guide with the kind of person who would pay $300 for whatever this night would bring. His name, she'd learned from Hollis, was Jonas McGrath. Beyond that, she knew nothing. Inside her chest, her heart waged war with itself. Shame burned hot and fierce, making her want to wheel the horse around and flee back to town, back to respectability, back to the safety of hunger and honest poverty. But stronger still was the image of her mother's face, pale and drawn with sickness, and Dr. Harrison's words. The new treatment from Philadelphia could make all the difference, but the cost, $300. The number echoed with each hoofbeat, a rhythm of damnation and salvation intertwined. "You're shaking," Jonas said suddenly, his deep voice cutting through the wind. "We'll stop soon to warm up." "I'm fine," she lied through chattering teeth. He turned to look at her then, really look at her, and she saw something unexpected flash across his weathered features. Concern, perhaps even regret. "No point in you freezing to death. That serves nobody." They rode for another hour before a structure emerged from the swirling snow, a small trapper's shelter, barely more than 4 walls and a roof. Jonas dismounted and began clearing snow from the entrance. "We'll rest the horses and warm up. Still got a ways to go." Inside, the shelter offered blessed relief from the wind. Jonas worked efficiently, starting a fire in the crude stone hearth with practiced ease. Eliza stood awkwardly near the door, unsure whether to help or stay out of his way. The flickering firelight cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the small space feel even more intimate. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a rough bench near the fire. "No sense standing there like a statue." She sat, holding her hands out to the flames. The warmth was painful at first as feeling returned to her fingers. Jonas rummaged in his saddlebags and produced a flask, taking a long pull before offering it to her. "I don't drink spirits," she said automatically. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Might want to reconsider, given the circumstances." The words hit like a slap, reminding her exactly why she was here, what she'd agreed to. Heat flooded her face, not from the fire, but from a shame so deep it seemed to burn from within. She grabbed the flask and took a defiant swig, coughing as the whiskey scorched her throat. "Easy," he said, taking it back. "That's not rotgut from town. That's the good stuff." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the shelter's door in its frame. Eliza found herself studying him again in the firelight. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 35, though the hard life of the mountains had etched lines around his eyes. His hands, she noticed, bore the scars of hard work, but they'd been gentle when helping her mount the horse. "Why?" The word escaped before she could stop it. He looked at her, eyebrows raised. "Why pay so much for this?" She gestured vaguely between them, unable to voice the full shame of it. Jonas was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost lost in the crackle of the fire. "Man gets lonely up in the mountains, sometimes lonely enough to do foolish things. There are women in town who—" She stopped, face burning again. "I know what kind of women work in town," he said curtly. "That's not what I'm after." "Then what are you after?" He turned to face her fully then, and she saw something raw in his expression, quickly hidden. One night of pretending things could be different. "That's all? Come morning, you'll have your money and be on your way. No harm done to either of us." The words should have reassured her, but instead they made her feel strangely sad. Here was another soul carved hollow by loneliness, willing to pay a fortune for the illusion of companionship. She thought of her own desperation, how it had driven her to this moment, and wondered if his was any different. "We should go," he said abruptly, standing and kicking snow over the fire. "Storm's getting worse." Back in the saddle, Eliza found the whiskey had helped. She felt warmer, though whether from the alcohol or from the strange moment of connection in the shelter, she couldn't say. The path grew steeper, winding between massive boulders and stands of pine so thick they blocked out what little moonlight filtered through the clouds. Jonas rode just ahead now, picking the way with sure knowledge. Several times he reached back to steady her horse when it stumbled on the icy ground. Each small kindness made her situation more confusing. She'd prepared herself for brutishness, for rough handling and crude demands. This quiet consideration left her defenses in shambles. "Almost there," he called back, voice nearly lost in the wind. A structure materialized from the darkness, larger than she'd expected, built of solid logs chinked with mud. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, suggesting he'd left a fire banked before coming to town. A lean-to shelter for horses stood to one side, and she could make out the shapes of a woodpile and what might be a smokehouse. Jonas saw to the horses while she stood in the snow, clutching her small bag of belongings and trying to quiet the terror rising in her throat. This was it. No turning back now. Her mother's life for one night of shame. The arithmetic was simple. Living with it would be anything but, "Come inside before you freeze," Jonas said, appearing at her elbow. He didn't touch her, she noticed, just waited for her to move of her own accord. The cabin's interior was a revelation. She'd expected squalor, the den of a mountain hermit. Instead, she found unexpected comfort. Handmade furniture polished smooth with use. Shelves lined with books. Even a glass window with real curtains. The main room served as kitchen, dining, and living space, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall. A bearskin rug covered the plank floor, and dried herbs hung from the rafters. Jonas moved about with practiced efficiency, adding wood to the fire and lighting oil lamps. "You can put your things there," he said, indicating a chest near the door. "Are you hungry? I've got stew that just needs heating." The domesticity of it all made her head spin. She'd imagined, well, she'd tried not to imagine anything, but certainly not this careful hospitality. Yes, thank you." While he busied himself at the stove, she removed her snow-covered coat and boots, acutely aware of every movement. The blue dress that had seemed appropriate in town now felt garish, too bright for this simple space. She sat carefully in one of the chairs by the fire, back straight, hands folded, trying to look like anything other than what she was, a woman who'd sold herself for money. "Here," Jonas said, setting a bowl of steaming stew before her. The smell made her stomach clench with sudden hunger. She'd been too nervous to eat all day. "It's nothing fancy, just venison and vegetables, but it'll warm you up." They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the wind howling outside. The stew was good, better than anything she'd had in the hotel, seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify. Jonas ate steadily but kept glancing at her, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "What did you expect?" He shrugged. "Someone harder, I suppose. Someone who'd done this before." Fresh shame washed over her. This is..." She couldn't finish. "I know," he said quietly. "It's written all over your face, which makes me wonder why you're here." The kindness in his voice undid her. Before she could stop them, words poured out about her mother's illness, the doctor's diagnosis, the cost of the treatment, her failed attempts to find work. She told him about the dwindling money, the desperation that had driven her west. The moment she'd stood outside the Silver Dollar knowing she was about to cross a line she could never uncross. When she finished, tears were streaming down her face. She wiped at them angrily, ashamed of the display. "I'm sorry. You didn't pay to hear my troubles." Jonas pushed back from the table and walked to the window, staring out at the swirling snow. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "My wife used to cry like that, quiet, like she was ashamed of her own sorrow." Eliza looked up, startled. Hollis had said he was a loner, had implied he'd always been alone. "She died 4 winters ago," he continued, still facing the window. "Her and our son. Fever took them while I was gone to Fort Laramie for supplies. By the time I got back," he trailed off, shoulders tight with old grief. "I'm sorry," Eliza whispered. He turned then, and she saw his own eyes were bright with unshed tears. "That's why I asked for this. Not for what you think. Just one night where this place doesn't echo with ghosts. One night of hearing another voice, seeing another face across the table. Pathetic, isn't it?" "No," she said softly. "It's not pathetic at all." They looked at each other across the lamplit room, 2 souls stripped bare by loss and need. The transaction that had brought them together, money for company, suddenly seemed both more and less than what she'd feared. Jonas cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "You can have the bed. I'll take the floor by the fire. But I thought..." "I know what you thought." His voice was gentle but firm. "And I know what you were prepared to do for your mother. But that's not what I need from you. Just stay. Talk to me. Be here. That's all." Relief and confusion warred in her chest. "Then why did you pay so much?" "Because I needed to be sure you'd come. And because..." He paused, seeming to search for words. "Because sometimes the only way to get what you need is to let people think you want something else. Folk understand a man paying for pleasure. They don't understand paying for..." He gestured helplessly at the space between them. "For not being alone." She finished. "Yes." The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows. Jonas added more wood to the fire, then showed her to the small bedroom. It was clean and simple. A bed with a colorful quilt, a washstand, pegs for clothes. On the small table by the bed sat a daguerreotype in a brass frame. A pretty woman with kind eyes held a small boy on her lap. "Sarah and Jacob," Jonas said from the doorway. "I know I should put it away, but—" "Don't," Eliza said quickly. "They should be remembered." He nodded, throat working. "There's clean water in the pitcher, extra blankets in the chest if you need them." He started to leave, then paused. "Thank you for staying." After he'd gone, Eliza sat on the edge of the bed, trying to make sense of the evening. She'd prepared herself for degradation, for using her body as currency in a devil's bargain. Instead, she'd found something far more complex, a man so hollowed out by grief that he would pay a fortune just to pretend, for one night, that he wasn't alone. She washed her face and changed into her nightdress, moving quietly in the strange space. Through the thin walls, she could hear Jonas settling by the fire, the creak of floorboards under his weight. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin felt like a small pocket of warmth carved out of the cold world, lying in bed, staring up at the rough-hewn ceiling. Eliza found herself thinking about the strange turns life could take. This morning she'd woken as one person, desperate, certainly, but still clinging to her ideas of respectability. Tonight she lay in a stranger's bed, $300 richer. Her virtue intact, but something fundamental changed nonetheless. She'd crossed a line by coming here, by accepting money for her presence. It didn't matter that Jonas wanted only company. She'd been willing to give more, had walked through that door prepared to sacrifice everything for her mother's life. The fact that the sacrifice hadn't been demanded didn't erase her willingness to make it. But perhaps, she thought as sleep finally began to claim her, that willingness was its own kind of honor. Perhaps love, real love, the kind that would do anything to save another, carried its own morality that transcended society's rules. In the main room, she heard Jonas moving about, the quiet sounds of a man preparing for a night on the floor. Such a strange, sad bargain they'd struck. But as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled within, Eliza found herself grateful for this unexpected reprieve, this moment of grace in the midst of desperation. Tomorrow she would return to town with the money that would save her mother's life. Tomorrow she would face whatever judgment awaited her. But tonight, in this cabin at the edge of the world, two broken people had found a moment of understanding. It wasn't what either of them had expected, but perhaps, Eliza thought as she drifted toward sleep, it was what they both had needed. Eliza woke to the sound of wood being split outside. Gray morning light filtered through the frost-covered window, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then memory crashed over her. The bargain. The midnight ride through snow. Jonas's unexpected kindness. She dressed quickly in her blue dress, fingers fumbling with the buttons, and ventured into the main room. Jonas had already been up for hours, judging by the fresh coffee on the stove and the neat stack of firewood by the hearth. Through the window, she could see him outside, axe rising and falling in steady rhythm. He'd shed his heavy coat despite the cold, working in just his shirt and suspenders. She watched, transfixed by the easy power in his movements, the way his breath clouded in the frigid air. When he came inside, carrying an armload of split logs, he seemed surprised to find her awake. "Morning, there's coffee if you want it, and biscuits from yesterday." "Thank you." She poured herself a cup, wrapping her hands around its warmth. The simple domesticity felt strange after the tension of the previous night. "You're up early." "Always am." Mountains don't care if a man wants to sleep late. He added logs to the fire, not quite meeting her eyes. "Snow's stopped, but it's deep. Might be a day or two before the path back to town is passable." Her heart lurched. "A day or two? But I need to—" "Your mother, I know." He straightened, brushing bark from his hands. "The money's yours regardless. That was the deal. But I can't take you back through those drifts. Too dangerous." Panic fluttered in her chest. Every day she delayed was another day her mother went without treatment. But as she looked out at the snow-buried landscape, she could see he was right. The path they'd traveled was invisible now, hidden under feet of fresh powder. "I'm sorry," Jonas said quietly. "I know you're anxious to get back." She nodded, trying to swallow her frustration. It wasn't his fault the weather had turned. "What do we do now?" "Same as any other snowbound day. Tend the animals, keep the fire going, try not to go stir-crazy." A wry smile touched his lips. "Though I suppose having company will make that last part easier." They fell into an awkward rhythm. Jonas showed her around the homestead, the root cellar stocked with preserves and vegetables, the smokehouse with its rows of dried meat, the small stable where he kept his horses, and a milk cow. Everything spoke of careful preparation, of a man who'd learned to be entirely self-sufficient. "Sarah planned most of this," he said as they stood in the root cellar, surveying shelves of canned goods. "She had a gift for seeing ahead, knowing what we'd need. I just try to keep it going the way she would have." Back in the cabin, Eliza insisted on helping with the noon meal. He watched bemused as she peeled potatoes and sliced the dried venison for stew. "You don't have to earn your keep," he said. "You're a guest, not a servant." "I need something to do with my hands," she replied. "Idle hands are the devil's playthorses. My mother always says." They worked side by side in comfortable silence. Eliza found herself relaxing by degrees, the terrible tension of the previous night slowly unwinding. Jonas was easy to be around once you got past his initial reserve. Quiet but not unfriendly, with a dry humor that surprised her. As they ate, he asked about her life back east. She told him about growing up in Pennsylvania, her father's death in the war, the way she and her mother had scraped by doing piecework for the textile mills. "You've had schooling," he observed. "The way you speak, carry yourself, that's not common for mill workers." "My mother insisted. She'd been a teacher before she married. She said education was the one thing no one could take from me." Eliza smiled sadly. "Though it hasn't done me much good out here." "Don't be so sure. Books are worth their weight in gold to a man who spends winters snowed in." He gestured to the shelves along one wall. "You're welcome to borrow any that catch your fancy." After the meal, she explored his small library while he mended a harness by the fire. The selection surprised her, not just the practical almanacs and guides she'd expected, but poetry, novels, even some philosophy, well-worn copies of Shakespeare nestled next to agricultural journals. "Sarah again?" she asked, pulling out a volume of Wordsworth. "Some, but I've always liked reading. Man needs something to keep his mind sharp up here, else the solitude will drive him mad." He looked up from his work. "Do you know that one?" She nodded, opening to a familiar page. "I wandered lonely as a cloud." "Read it," he said quietly. "If you don't mind. Been a long time since I heard poetry spoken aloud." So she read, her voice filling the quiet cabin. While Jonas worked and the fire crackled and the snow-buried world outside seemed very far away. When she finished, they sat in companionable silence. "Sarah used to read to me in the evenings," he said finally. "Said it civilized me." His smile was bittersweet. Maybe she was right. As afternoon wore into evening, the enforced intimacy began to work a strange magic. They talked more freely about books, about the challenges of frontier life, about dreams deferred and plans gone awry. Eliza found herself laughing at his story about trying to milk his first cow, and he listened intently as she described the ocean voyage her grandparents had taken from Ireland. "You should write those stories down," he said. "Family history like that, it's precious, too easily lost." When darkness fell, there was an awkward moment as they prepared for sleep. But Jonas simply gathered blankets and made his bed by the fire again, waving off her protests. "I've slept on harder ground than this. Besides, the fire needs tending through the night." Eliza retreated to the bedroom, but sleep eluded her. Through the thin door, she could hear Jonas moving about, adding wood to the fire, the creak of floorboards as he settled for the night. The wind had picked up again, moaning through the eaves, and she shivered despite the warm quilts. Time passed, marked by the ticking of a clock she couldn't see. Finally, unable to stand the cold and the solitude, she wrapped a quilt around her shoulders and ventured into the main room. Jonas sat by the fire, a book open in his lap but his eyes fixed on the flames. He looked up as she entered, concern creasing his features. Too cold? A little. She hesitated, then sat in the chair across from him, pulling the quilt tighter. And I couldn't sleep. Strange place, I suppose. Takes getting used to. He marked his place in the book and set it aside. Would you like some warm milk? Sometimes helps. While he heated milk on the stove, adding a touch of honey and cinnamon. Eliza studied him in the firelight. The grief he carried was visible in the lines of his face, the careful way he moved through the cabin, as if afraid of disturbing ghosts. Yet there was strength there too, a quiet endurance that spoke of a man who'd learned to carry on despite his losses. Can I ask you something? She said as he handed her the warm mug. He nodded, settling back in his chair. Why stay here? After what happened? Why not leave? Start fresh somewhere else? Jonas was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice was low, thoughtful. Thought about it. God knows I've thought about it, but... He gestured vaguely at the cabin around them. This place. We built it together. Every log, every stone in that fireplace has our hands on it. Sarah's buried on the hillside above the meadow, where she loved to pick wildflowers. Jacob's beside her. His voice caught, and he paused to master himself. If I leave, who'll tend their graves? Who'll remember the way Sarah laughed when she was truly happy? Or how Jacob used to chase fireflies in the summer evenings? No, I can't leave. This is where they were, so this is where I stay. Eliza felt tears prick her eyes. That's beautiful, and terribly sad. It's both, he agreed. Most true things are. They sat quietly, sipping warm milk and watching the fire, the intimacy of the moment, sitting in night clothes, sharing confidences in the small hours. Should have felt improper. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Your turn, Jonas said. Can I ask you something? She nodded, though her heart began to race. Last night, when you agreed to come here, were you really prepared to do what you thought I wanted? Heat flooded her face, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. Yes, I was. That must have been terrifying. It was. She set down her mug, hands trembling slightly. I was raised to believe that a woman's virtue was her most precious possession. But when it came down to it, when I had to choose between my virtue and my mother's life, she shrugged helplessly. It wasn't even a choice. You love her very much. She's all I have, and I'm all she has. Tears spilled over now, and she wiped at them impatiently. I'm sorry. I seem to cry a lot around you. Nothing wrong with tears, Jonas said gently. Shows you're still alive inside. It's when the tears stop that you need to worry. Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. When did yours stop? The day I buried them. Stood at those graves and felt something inside me just shut off, like a lamp being blown out. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. That's really why I made that bargain with Hollis? Not for what you thought. God, never that. But I was starting to forget I was human. Starting to become just another creature denning up for winter. I needed... He struggled for words. To remember, she finished softly. Yes, to remember what it felt like to care about someone else's troubles, to share a meal and conversation, to feel something other than the endless cold inside. He looked at her then, and she saw vulnerability in his eyes that took her breath away. You've given me that, Eliza, more than you know. The sound of her name on his lips sent an unexpected shiver through her. They looked at each other across the flickering firelight, and something shifted in the air between them. The transactional nature of their arrangement seemed to fall away, leaving just two wounded souls finding unexpected comfort in each other's company. Eliza rose, the quilt slipping from her shoulders. Jonas stood as well, uncertainty written across his features. For a long moment they simply stood there, a few feet apart, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls. "I should go back to bed," she whispered, but didn't move. "Yes," he agreed, equally still. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Inside, the only sound was the pop of logs in the fire and their quiet breathing. Then, as if drawn by some invisible force, they moved toward each other. The kiss was gentle at first, almost hesitant, two people who'd forgotten how to trust reaching out despite their fear. But as Eliza's arms came up around his neck and Jonas pulled her closer, something ignited between them. Not just desire, though that was there, but a desperate need for connection, for proof that they were still capable of feeling. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Jonas touched her face with wondering fingers. "Eliza, Shh." She placed a finger against his lips. "No words. Not tonight." He searched her eyes, looking for doubt or fear, finding none. He took her hand and led her not to the bedroom but to the pile of blankets by the fire. They came together again with a hunger born of loneliness and loss, finding in each other's arms a temporary refuge from the cold world outside. Later, as they lay entwined before the dying fire, Eliza traced the scars on Jonas's chest, marks of a hard life lived in an unforgiving land. He caught her hand, pressing it flat against his heart. "This changes things," he said quietly. "I know. The money is still yours. That hasn't changed, but this wasn't part of any bargain." She rose on one elbow to look at him. "No, this was just us." He pulled her back down, holding her close as if afraid she might disappear. Outside, the wind was dying, and through the window, stars appeared between breaking clouds. The storm was passing, which meant the path to town would soon be clear. But for now, in the warm circle of firelight, tomorrow seemed very far away. Eliza closed her eyes, feeling Jonas's heartbeat strong and steady beneath her cheek. She'd come here prepared to sacrifice everything for duty. Instead, she'd found something she hadn't even known she was looking for, a connection forged in the crucible of shared pain and unexpected understanding. Morning would bring decisions and consequences, but for these few precious hours, she allowed herself to simply be held, to feel less alone in the vast, cold wilderness of the world. Dawn crept across the mountain peaks like a cautious visitor, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold. Eliza woke slowly, momentarily disoriented by the warmth surrounding her. She lay nestled against Jonas's chest, his arm draped protectively across her waist, the dying embers of the fire casting a gentle glow across the cabin. Memory flooded back, not with shame as she'd expected, but with a curious sense of rightness. What had passed between them in the night hadn't been the transaction she'd steeled herself for, but something altogether different, something that had surprised them both. Jonas stirred, his arm tightening briefly before his eyes opened. For a moment they simply looked at each other, acknowledging silently what had changed. Then he pressed a kiss to her forehead and carefully disentangled himself. "I'll start the fire," he said softly. "It's cold." She watched him work, noting the careful way he moved, as if giving her space to process what had happened. When the fire was crackling merrily, he turned back to her. "The path should be clear enough by noon. I can take you back to town then, if you want." "If you want." The words hung in the air between them. Yesterday, she would have been desperate to leave, to complete her mission and return to her mother. Now, the thought of leaving this warm sanctuary made her chest tight with an emotion she didn't care to examine too closely. "Yes," she said finally. "I should go. My mother, of course." He busied himself with making coffee, but she caught the flash of something, disappointment, across his features. They dressed in separate rooms, a sudden shyness overtaking them both. When Eliza emerged in her blue dress, now wrinkled from its time draped over a chair, Jonas was already frying bacon and eggs. The domestic scene struck her with unexpected poignancy. "Eat hearty," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "It's a long ride down." They ate in relative silence. the easy companionship of the previous day replaced by an awkward awareness. Finally, Eliza couldn't stand it. "Jonas, about last night, was a gift," he interrupted gently. "One I didn't expect and don't regret, but I understand it doesn't change your circumstances. You need to get back to your mother." She nodded, throat tight. "The money is in the saddlebag, all of it, as promised." He paused, then added quietly, "Though God knows you've earned it in ways neither of us expected." After breakfast, Jonas went to ready the horses while Eliza gathered her few belongings. She stood in the bedroom doorway for a moment, looking at the bed she hadn't slept in, at the daguerreotype of Sarah and Jacob on the nightstand. Such a strange journey this had been. Outside, the world was transformed. Where yesterday had been only swirling gray and white, today revealed a landscape of breathtaking beauty. The sun sparkled off pristine snow, and the mountains rose majestically against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Jonas had both horses saddled and was adjusting the straps when she emerged. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Always is, after a storm." He helped her mount, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary at her waist. "Sarah used to say the mountains were God's way of reminding us how small our troubles really are." They set off down the path, Jonas leading the way, testing the depth of snow with a long pole. The journey that had seemed so ominous in the darkness now revealed itself as a passage through winter wonderland. Ice crystals sparkled in the air, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the call of an eagle. "Tell me more about her," Eliza said suddenly. "About Sarah." Jonas glanced back, surprised. "What would you like to know?" "Everything, how you met, what she was like. If you don't mind talking about it." For a while, the only sound was the crunch of snow under hooves. Then Jonas began to speak, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Met her in Independence, Missouri. I was buying supplies for a trapping expedition, and she was there with her father, who ran a general store. Took one look at her standing behind that counter, sun coming through the window and lighting up her hair like copper fire, and I knew I was done for." He smiled at the memory. "Course, she wanted nothing to do with some rough mountain man. Took me 3 months of finding excuses to visit that store before she'd even speak to me beyond, 'That'll be $2. Mr. McGrath." What changed her mind? Her father's horse got spooked by a snake, threw him bad, broke his leg in 2 places. I happened to be there, helped get him to the doctor, then stayed to help run the store while he recovered. Sarah said later it was watching me try to be gentle with the old ladies buying thread that did it. Said any man that big who could be that careful was worth knowing better. They paused at a scenic overlook, the valley spreading below them like a rumpled white blanket. Jonas dismounted to check something on his horse's hoof, and Eliza found herself studying his profile as he worked. "You loved her very much," she said softly. "More than I knew was possible." He straightened, looking out over the valley. "She gave up everything to come up here with me, her family, the comforts of town life, everything. Never complained, not once. Said as long as we were together, we were home. And Jacob," his face softened. "Born during a spring storm. I was so scared I could barely hold the scissors to cut the cord. But Sarah, she was calm as could be. Said women had been doing this since Eve, and she wasn't about to be the first to fail at it." He shook his head. "That boy. He had his mother's eyes and my stubborn streak. Lord help us, he was a handful." They continued down the mountain, Jonas sharing memories like precious gifts. How Sarah had insisted on planting flowers around the cabin, coaxing beauty from the harsh soil. How Jacob had taken his first steps chasing a butterfly. How the 3 of them would sit outside summer evenings, watching the stars emerge while Sarah sang Irish lullabies her grandmother had taught her. "The fever came on sudden," he said as they navigated a particularly steep section. "I thought it was just a cold at first, but Sarah, she knew. Sent me to Fort Laramie for medicine. Made me promise to ride fast. I did, but..." His voice broke slightly. "Storm caught me on the way back. By the time I made it home, They were both burning up. I did everything I could think of. Everything the doctor at the fort had told me. Wasn't enough. Eliza blinked back tears. How long were they sick? 3 days. Sarah went first, just as the sun was rising. I think she held on as long as she could, trying to stay for Jacob. But in the end, he cleared his throat roughly. Jacob followed her that evening. Doctor said later it was probably best. Child that young, losing his mother. At least they went together. They rode in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. As the sun climbed higher, the temperature rose slightly, and Eliza loosened her coat. She found herself memorizing the journey, the way the light played through the pine boughs, the distant sound of running water under the ice, the broad set of Jonas's shoulders as he rode ahead. It was mid-afternoon when the first signs of civilization appeared. Tracks in the snow from other travelers. Then a thin column of smoke in the distance. Finally, the ramshackle buildings of Casper came into view. Jonas pulled up at the edge of town, turning in his saddle to face her. I won't take you all the way in. People talk, and you don't need that kind of attention. She understood. A woman arriving from the mountains with Jonas McGrath would raise eyebrows and start tongues wagging. Thank you, she said. For everything. He dismounted and helped her down, then retrieved the saddlebag with the money. As he handed it to her, their fingers brushed, and that electric connection sparked between them again. Eliza, he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with words. What happened between us? I want you to know it meant something. You brought light back into a place that's been dark for too long. You saved me too, she said quietly. Not just with the money, but by showing me that kindness still exists, even in the hardest places. They stood there, hands still touching over the saddlebag, neither wanting to be the first to let go. Finally, Jonas stepped back. Your mother's waiting, he said roughly. You should go. She nodded, not trusting her voice. She'd taken perhaps 10 steps when his voice stopped her. Eliza, she turned back. When you've seen to your mother, if you ever... He stopped, shook his head. Safe travels. She wanted to run back to him, to promise things she had no right to promise. Instead, she raised her hand in farewell and continued toward town. The weight of the money in the saddlebag nothing compared to the weight in her chest. The Frontier Hotel looked exactly as she'd left it, down to Hollis sitting at the front desk. His eyebrows rose as she entered. Well, the Eastern Flower returns. Thought maybe the mountain had swallowed you up. I need to send a wire, she said crisply, ignoring his insinuation. And book passage on the next stage heading east. Stage leaves day after tomorrow. As for the wire, Western Union's 2 blocks down. He leaned forward, eyes glittering with curiosity. Everything work out to your satisfaction? She fixed him with a steady gaze. The business arrangement was completed as agreed. That's all you need to know. Something in her tone must have warned him off further questions. He slid the register toward her. Same room's available if you want it. In her room. Eliza counted out the money with shaking hands. $300. All there as Jonas had promised. Enough to save her mother's life. She should have felt victorious, relieved. Instead, she felt strangely hollow. She wrote out the telegram carefully. Have funds for treatment. Stop. Returning soonest. Stop. Hold on, mother. Stop. All my love. Stop. At the Western Union office, she paid to have it sent immediately, then arranged for the money to be wired to Dr. Harrison's account. The clerk's eyes widened at the amount, but he processed it without comment. Walking back to the hotel, Eliza noticed how different the town looked to her now, where before she'd seen only roughness and indifference. Now she noticed the small kindnesses, a man helping a woman with heavy packages, a shopkeeper giving a piece of candy to a child, 2 old-timers sharing a laugh outside the barber shop. In her room that night, she lay fully dressed on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, somewhere up in those mountains. Jonas was alone again in his cabin, perhaps sitting by the fire where they'd... She pushed the thought away. What had happened between them was a moment stolen from time, made possible only by extraordinary circumstances. She had responsibilities, a life waiting for her back east. He had his ghosts and his self-imposed exile. But as she finally drifted toward sleep, she found herself thinking not of the home she was returning to, but of a cabin in the mountains where the fire was warm and the silence was peaceful. And a man with gentle hands and sad eyes had shown her that sometimes the most unexpected paths led to the most profound discoveries. The money would save her mother's life, but the memory of these few days, and the man who'd turned a devil's bargain into something approaching grace, would stay with her far longer than any currency ever could. The stagecoach was scheduled to depart at dawn, but Eliza stood at the window of her hotel room, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of amber and rose. 2 days had passed since Jonas had left her at the edge of town. 2 days of waiting and preparing for the journey home. She'd bought supplies for the trip, written letters to be posted ahead of her arrival, and tried very hard not to think about a cabin in the mountains and the man who lived there alone. A commotion in the street below drew her attention. 3 men on horseback had stopped in front of the hotel, their voices carrying clearly in the cold morning air. She recognized one of them, a rough-looking fellow who'd been playing cards with Hollis that night at the Silver Dollar. McGrath definitely had her, the man was saying. Saw them riding out together myself. 3 days she was up there. 3 days. Another man whistled low. Must have really took a shine to her. Usually his type of business don't take that long. Eliza's blood ran cold. They were talking about her, about Jonas. She pressed closer to the window, keeping to the shadows. Hollis says she's heading back east today, the first man continued. Shame. Pretty thing like that could make good money here if she had the right management. Maybe she don't need to leave just yet, the third man suggested, and something in his tone made Eliza's skin crawl. Maybe someone should explain the opportunities she's missing. They dismounted, heading for the hotel entrance. Panic flared in Eliza's chest. She grabbed her packed bag and the coat Jonas had insisted she keep, a heavy fur-lined one that had belonged to Sarah, and slipped out of her room. The back stairs were narrow and dusty, rarely used, but they led to the alley behind the hotel. She could hear voices in the lobby as she eased out the back door. The stagecoach wouldn't leave for another hour, and the station was across town. Too exposed, too easy to find her there. She needed somewhere to hide until... Going somewhere, miss? Eliza spun around. One of the men stood at the alley entrance, blocking her path. Up close, she could smell the whiskey on him, see the calculating look in his eyes. The stage doesn't leave for an hour, he said conversationally, moving closer. Plenty of time for us to have a talk about your future. Man like me could protect a woman alone, make sure she's taken care of. I don't need protection, Eliza said, proud that her voice didn't shake. Please let me pass. Now that's not very friendly. He reached for her arm. After all, we're practically acquainted. Any woman who'd spend 3 days with Jonas McGrath must be in the business of being friendly. She jerked away from his grasp, but he was quick, catching her wrist and pulling her against him. The smell of him, stale sweat and tobacco, made her stomach turn. Let me go. Feisty. I like that. McGrath must have... He never finished the sentence. A hand fell on his shoulder and spun him around, followed immediately by a fist that sent him sprawling in the muddy alley. Jonas stood over him, fury radiating from every line of his body. Touch her again and I'll kill you, he said quietly. And something in his tone made it clear this was not a threat, but a simple statement of fact. The man scrambled to his feet, hand going to his bloodied nose. This ain't your business. McGrath, she ain't at your cabin now. Everything about her is my business. Jonas stepped forward, placing himself between Eliza and her assailant. Her, the stage she's taking, the air she breathes, all of it, mine, and I protect what's mine. 2 more men appeared at the alley entrance, the companions from earlier. They took in the scene, their friend's bloodied face, Jonas's protective stance, and seemed to make a quick calculation. Not worth it, Bart. one of them said. "Come on." Bart spat blood onto the ground. "This ain't over. McGrath." "Yes," Jonas said evenly. "It is." They retreated, casting dark looks over their shoulders. Only when they were gone did Jonas turn to Eliza, his expression shifting from dangerous to deeply concerned. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, then suddenly found herself trembling. Jonas caught her as her knees threatened to buckle, pulling her against his chest. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I don't know why I'm—" "Shock," he said quietly, stroking her back. "It's all right. You're safe now." They stood that way for several moments, Eliza drawing strength from his solid presence. Finally, she pulled back enough to look up at him. "What are you doing here? How did you know?" A rueful smile touched his lips. "Couldn't stay away. Been camped outside town for 2 days, trying to convince myself to let you go. Then I saw those bastards heading for the hotel. Heard them talking." His jaw tightened. "I'm sorry. This is my fault. People knowing you were with me, it's put a target on you." "It's not your fault," she said firmly. "Those men would have been the same regardless." He studied her face, then seemed to make a decision. "Come on, let's get you somewhere safe until the stage arrives." He led her through back alleys to a small church at the edge of town. The minister's wife, a plump woman with kind eyes, took one look at Eliza's pale face and ushered them inside. "Of course she can wait here, Mrs." Patterson said after Jonas explained briefly. "I'll make some tea. You look frozen, dear." When she bustled off, Jonas and Eliza sat in a pew near the window where they could watch for the stagecoach. Filtered sunlight through stained glass painted rainbow patterns on the wooden floor. "I can't stop thinking about it," Jonas said suddenly. "These 2 days, the cabin feels emptier than ever. I keep turning to say something to you, and you're not there." Eliza's heart clenched. "Jonas, I know you have to go. I know your mother needs you. I'm not asking you to stay." He took a breath. "But I need you to know that what happened between us, it changed something in me. Woke something up I thought was dead forever. It changed me too," she admitted softly. "I'll never forget." "Don't." He turned to face her fully. "Don't talk about it like it's already just a memory, like we're already ghosts to each other." "Mrs." Patterson returned with tea and discreet sympathy, then found reasons to busy herself in another room. They sat in companionable silence, hands not quite touching on the pew between them, watching dust motes dance in the colored light. "Tell me about your mother," Jonas said eventually. "What's she like?" So Eliza did, sharing stories of her childhood, her mother's strength after her father's death, the way she'd held their small family together through sheer force of will. Jonas listened intently, asking questions, laughing at her description of their disastrous attempt to keep chickens in their tiny yard. "She sounds like Sarah would have liked her," he said. "Strong women, both of them." The distant sound of a horn made them both look up. Through the window, they could see the stagecoach rolling into town, fresh horses being led out for the exchange. "It's time," Eliza said unnecessarily. They walked to the station together, Jonas carrying her bag. The driver was loading luggage while passengers found their seats. Too soon. It was her turn to board. "Wait," Jonas said suddenly. He pulled something from his coat, a small leather pouch. "Take this." She looked inside to find a delicate silver locket on a chain. Opening it revealed 2 tiny photographs, Sarah on one side, Jacob on the other. "Jonas, I can't. Please." His voice was rough. "Sarah would have wanted. She always said beautiful things shouldn't be hidden away. They should be worn, enjoyed, shared with the world." Tears blurred her vision as he fastened the chain around her neck. The locket settled warm against her chest, just over her heart. "All aboard," the driver called. Jonas helped her into the coach, his hands lingering on hers. "Take care of yourself. Eliza Hartley. You too. Jonas McGrath." The coach lurched into motion. Through the window, she watched him stand there in the street, a solitary figure growing smaller with distance. He raised one hand in farewell, and she pressed her palm against the glass, trying to hold on to the image of him. Miles passed. The mountains receded, giving way to foothills and then plains. Other passengers chatted around her, but Eliza sat silent, one hand touching the locket at her throat. Inside her bag, the money that would save her mother's life sat secure. She'd accomplished what she'd set out to do. She should feel triumphant. Instead, she felt as if she'd left some essential part of herself in a cabin in the mountains, with a man who'd shown her that sometimes the most profound connections came from the most unexpected circumstances. Night fell, and still the coach rolled on, carrying her back to the life she'd known, away from the one she'd briefly glimpsed. But as she finally dozed, lulled by the swaying motion, Eliza dreamed not of home but of mountains crowned with snow, of firelight in gentle hands, of a love discovered in the space between heartbreak and hope. The locket was warm against her skin, a tangible reminder that it had all been real. And somewhere in those distant peaks, a man sat alone by his fire, holding on to the memory of 3 days when his empty cabin had been filled with light. Neither of them knew then that this was not an ending but a pause. That fate, having brought them together once, was far from finished with their story. But for now, distance grew between them with each turn of the wheels, and Eliza let herself grieve for what was left behind, even as she raced toward what lay ahead. The stage stopped at a way station to change horses, stepping out to stretch her legs. Eliza looked back toward the mountains, now just a dark line against the stars. "I'll come back," she whispered, surprising herself with the fierce certainty of it. "Somehow, I'll come back." Then she climbed back into the coach and let it carry her onward, toward duty and family and the life that waited. But her heart remained in the mountains, with a man who taught her that sometimes the greatest gifts came disguised as the hardest choices, and that love could bloom even in the coldest winter, if two souls were brave enough to let it. The wheels of the stagecoach had barely stopped rolling when Eliza heard her name called. Doctor. Harrison himself stood on the platform, his weathered face grave with concern. "Miss Hartley? Thank God. I received your wire. Your mother, she's holding on, but barely. I've already begun the new treatment with the funds you sent." Eliza's heart lurched. Will she? "There's hope now," he said gently, taking her bag. "Real hope, but she's been asking for you constantly. Come, my carriage is waiting." The familiar streets of her Pennsylvania town blurred past as they hurried to the small house she'd called home. Everything looked smaller than she remembered, more cramped and gray after the vast openness of Wyoming. Mrs. O'Brien from next door was just leaving as they arrived. "She's sleeping," the older woman whispered. "Poor dear's been fighting so hard, but she perked up something wonderful when the doctor said you were coming home." Eliza crept into the tiny bedroom, her breath catching at the sight of her mother. Margaret Hartley had always been a sturdy woman, built solid from years of hard work. Now she seemed to have shrunk into herself, her skin paper-thin and pale against the pillows. But her breathing was steady, and when Eliza took her hand, it was warm. "Mother," she whispered. Margaret's eyes fluttered open, focusing with effort. "Eliza, my girl, is it really you?" "I'm here. Mother, I'm home." Tears slipped down her mother's hollow cheeks. I was so afraid I'd never see you again. The doctor says you found the money for the medicine." "How?" "Shh," Eliza soothed, smoothing her mother's hair. "Don't worry about that now. Just rest and get better. That's all that matters." Over the following weeks, Eliza threw herself into caring for her mother. The new treatment was harsh. It left Margaret nauseated and weak. But slowly, incrementally, it began to work. Color returned to her cheeks. She could sit up for longer periods. The violent coughing fits that had racked her body grew less frequent. Eliza took in sewing work to pay for their daily needs, her fingers flying over the fabric in the evenings while she sat by her mother's bed. But her mind often wandered to a cabin in the mountains, to a man who'd shown her kindness when she'd expected cruelty. At night, she'd lie in her narrow bed and touch the locket at her throat, opening it to study the tiny photographs by candlelight. Sarah's gentle smile and Jacob's bright eyes looked back at her, and she wondered if Jonas was sitting by his fire, alone with his memories. She'd written him once, a brief note to say she'd arrived safely and her mother was improving. She'd agonized over every word, unsure how to capture what she felt on paper. In the end, she'd kept it simple, signing it, with gratitude and affection, Eliza. She'd sent it in care of the general store in Casper, hoping it would find its way to him. No reply came. Spring arrived with a burst of color that seemed almost violent after the monochrome winter. Margaret was well enough now to sit in the garden. Her face turned to the sun like a flower seeking light. It was there that she finally asked the question Eliza had been dreading. "You never told me how you got the money." Eliza's hand stilled on the mending in her lap. "Does it matter? You're my daughter. Everything about you matters." Margaret studied her with eyes that missed nothing. "You've been different since you came back. Sadder, somehow, like you left part of yourself out there." The words were so accurate that Eliza felt tears threaten. "I did what I had to do. I know." Her mother reached over and took her hand. "And I'm grateful to be alive. But Eliza, my dear girl, I never wanted my life to come at the cost of your happiness." "It didn't," Eliza said quickly. Too quickly. Margaret was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "You wear a locket now that you didn't have before. Sometimes I see you hold it when you think no one's looking, and your eyes, they look the way mine did after your father left for the war." Eliza's composure finally cracked. The whole story poured out. The desperate journey west, the bargain she'd made, Jonas's unexpected kindness, the connection that had sparked between them. She told her mother about the cabin, about Sarah and Jacob, about 3 days that had changed something fundamental inside her. When she finished, Margaret was crying quietly. "Oh, my brave girl, what you were willing to do for me. I'd do it again," Eliza said fiercely. "I know you would. That's what frightens me." Margaret squeezed her hand. "This man, Jonas, he sounds like a good soul. He is, but his life is there, and mine is here. You need me." "I'm getting stronger every day. Soon I won't need constant care." Margaret's eyes were knowing. "What will keep you here then?" Eliza didn't answer because she didn't know. Each day that passed, she felt more like she was living someone else's life. She went through the motions, cooking, cleaning, sewing, tending her mother, but her heart wasn't in it. At night, she dreamed of mountains and snow, of a deep voice reading poetry by firelight, of strong arms that had held her like she was something precious. Summer came with its humid heat, so different from the dry mountain air. Margaret was well enough now to resume some of her own sewing work, though Eliza still fussed over her. They were working together one evening, windows open to catch any breeze, when Mrs. O'Brien knocked at the door. "Letter for you, dear," she said, handing Eliza an envelope. "Mailman said it's come a long way." Eliza's hands trembled as she recognized the writing. Her name was spelled out in Jonas's careful script. She excused herself and went to her room, heart pounding. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a pressed wildflower, Indian paintbrush, bright red despite being dried. The letter was brief. "Eliza, your letter found me. I'm glad your mother is improving. The cabin is too quiet. I finally understand why the Indians say some places can be haunted by the living as well as the dead. The meadow above Sarah's grave is full of these flowers now. She would have loved them. I think of you when I see them, bright spots of color in a harsh landscape, beautiful and resilient. I hope you are well. I hope you are happy. I hope, well, I have no right to hope for more. Yours, Jonas." Eliza pressed the flower to her lips, tears streaming down her face. She could see him writing it, probably at the same rough table where they'd shared meals. Could imagine him walking the meadow, thinking of her, choosing just the right bloom to send. "Eliza?" Her mother stood in the doorway, concern etched on her features. "What is it, dear?" Wordlessly, Eliza handed her the letter. Margaret read it slowly, then sat beside her daughter on the bed. "He loves you. He never said he doesn't need to. It's in every word." Margaret smoothed the letter carefully. "And you love him?" "Yes," Eliza whispered. It was the first time she'd said it aloud, and the truth of it rang like a bell in the small room. "But I can't leave you." "Can't or won't?" Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. "Eliza, I didn't raise you to sacrifice your happiness for mine. Your father wouldn't have wanted that either. But you've been so sick, and now I'm getting better. Thanks to you, thanks to what you were willing to do." Margaret cupped her daughter's face in her hands. "You saved my life, my darling girl. Now let me give yours back to you." They talked long into the night, making plans. Margaret's sister in Philadelphia had been asking her to come stay, wanting help with her new millinery shop. It would be good for Margaret. A change of scene, light work to keep her busy, family around her. But what if Jonas doesn't? Eliza couldn't finish the thought. "Then you'll know," her mother said simply. "But you'll never forgive yourself if you don't try." The decision, once made, brought a strange peace. Eliza threw herself into preparations with energy she hadn't felt in months. She helped her mother pack, arranged the journey to Philadelphia, settled their small affairs, and finally, on a crisp September morning, she found herself once again at a train station, once again heading west. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't running toward salvation but choosing her path. The money in her purse was earned from her own labor, not bought with desperation, and the locket at her throat felt like a compass, drawing her home. The journey seemed both endless and too quick. Familiar landmarks appeared, the Mississippi River, the endless plains. Finally, the first glimpse of mountains on the horizon. Her heart beat faster with each mile that passed. In Casper, she hired a horse and guide, ignoring the curious looks. The town had grown some in her absence, new buildings rising along the main street, but she barely noticed, focused only on the path ahead. "You sure about this, miss?" the guide asked as they started up the mountain trail. "McGrath ain't exactly expecting company." "No," Eliza agreed, nerves fluttering in her stomach. "He's not." The path was easier without snow, but her heart pounded from more than exertion as they climbed higher. What if he'd changed his mind? What if the connection she'd felt had been one-sided, born of extraordinary circumstances that couldn't survive ordinary life? What if— "That's his place," the guide said, pointing. The cabin sat just as she remembered, smoke rising from the chimney. But now she could see the meadow Jonas had written about, awash with Indian paintbrush and late summer flowers. A figure moved near the woodpile, tall, broad-shouldered, achingly familiar. "I'll go back now," the guide said, correctly reading her expression. "Looks like you can find your way from here." Eliza dismounted on shaking legs. She was halfway to the cabin when Jonas looked up. The axe fell from his hands, and for a long moment they simply stared at each other across the distance. Then she was running, and he was moving toward her, and they met in a collision of joy and relief. Jonas caught her up in his arms, lifting her off her feet, burying his face in her hair. "You came back," he said, voice rough with emotion. "God in heaven, you came back!" "I had to," she gasped, laughing and crying at once. "I left my heart here." He set her down just enough to kiss her, and it was like coming home after a long, cold journey. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Jonas touched her face as if to assure himself she was real. "Your mother? Getting stronger every day. She sends her regards." Eliza smiled through her tears. She said any man who could make her daughter look so lost deserved a chance to make her look found again. Wise woman. He kissed her again, softly this time. "How long can you stay?" Eliza took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "That depends. How long will you have me?" Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed quickly by a joy so profound it took her breath away. "Forever," he said simply. "If you'll have me, if you can stand the isolation, the hard work, She stopped his words with another kiss. "I've lived in civilization all my life," she said against his lips. "It never felt like home. This does. You do." Later, as they sat by the fire where their story had truly begun, Jonas showed her the improvements he'd made to the cabin, a room he'd started adding. Just in case, he said shyly. Shelves he'd built for the books he hoped she'd want. A garden plot he'd cleared, remembering how she'd said her mother grew herbs. I didn't dare hope, he admitted. But I couldn't stop preparing, either. As night fell, they walked hand in hand to the meadow above Sarah's grave. Jonas had kept his promise. The graves were well tended, marked now with proper stones. Eliza knelt and placed her own wildflower offering beside them. "Thank you," she whispered to the woman who'd loved Jonas first. "Thank you for raising him to be the man he is. I promise to take care of him." The wind sighed through the pines, and for just a moment, Eliza could have sworn she felt an approving presence, a gentle blessing on what was to come. They were married a week later in the small church where Eliza had hidden from those men, Mrs. Patterson beamed as her husband performed the ceremony, and even gruff old Hollis attended, muttering something about how some gambles paid off better than expected. As Jonas carried her over the threshold of their mountain home, Eliza touched the locket at her throat one more time, then let it go. The past would always be part of their story, but the future stretched before them now, bright with promise. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, but inside the cabin was warm with firelight and hope. And in the years that followed, the mountains would echo not with loneliness, but with laughter, with children's voices, with the sound of a love that had begun in desperation but grown into something as enduring as the peaks themselves. The bargain that had brought them together was complete, but the life they built from it had only just begun. 3 months had passed since their wedding, and winter held the mountains in its fierce grip. Eliza had adapted to the rhythms of mountain life, the early mornings tending animals, the constant work of keeping the household running, the deep satisfaction of self-sufficiency. But this morning brought troubling news with Jonas's return from his monthly supply run to town. "Letter from your mother," he said, handing her the envelope with careful gentleness. Eliza's hands trembled as she read. Her mother's usually steady handwriting was shaky. The words brief. "My darling, the sickness has returned. Doctor fears the treatment is no longer working. I don't want to worry you, but I long to see you once more. Your loving mother." The paper fluttered from her numb fingers. Jonas caught her as her knees buckled, guiding her to a chair by the fire. "How bad?" he asked quietly. "She says the treatment stopped working." Tears coursed down her cheeks. "I have to go to her. Of course, we'll leave at first light. We..." She looked up at him through her tears. "You don't think I'd let you face this alone?" He cupped her face gently. "We're married. Eliza, your sorrows are mine, just as your joys are." They spent the rest of the day preparing for the journey. It would be arduous in winter. The mountain passes were treacherous with ice, and storms could strand travelers for days. But Eliza's urgency drove them forward. That night, as they lay together in their bed, Jonas held her close. "Tell me about her," he said. "Tell me your favorite memory." So Eliza did, her voice soft in the darkness. She told him about summer evenings when her mother would take her to the creek to catch fireflies, how they'd release them and make wishes on their blinking lights, how her mother had sold her own mother's brooch to buy Eliza books when she showed an aptitude for reading, how she'd held Eliza the night her father left for war, promising that love never truly left. It just changed form. "She sounds remarkable," Jonas murmured against her hair. "She'll love you," Eliza said. "She already does, for making me happy." Dawn came too soon, bringing with it the beginning of their difficult journey. Jonas had arranged everything: the strongest horses, extra supplies, warm furs. They set off as the first pale light touched the mountain peaks. The first day went well enough, though the cold was bitter. They made good time to the way station where they'd stopped that first night months ago. But on the second day, the weather turned. Snow began falling thick and fast, and the wind picked up until it was hard to see more than a few feet ahead. "We need to find shelter." Jonas called over the howl of the wind. They pushed on until they found a cave Jonas knew of, used by trappers in emergencies. Inside, they built a small fire and huddled together, waiting for the storm to pass. "I'm slowing us down," Eliza said, frustration and fear making her voice sharp. "Every hour we delay could save our lives." Jonas finished firmly. "You can't help your mother if you freeze to death trying to reach her." The storm raged for a day and a half. When it finally cleared, they dug their way out to find the world transformed. Massive drifts blocked the usual paths, and Jonas had to scout ahead constantly to find passable routes. On the fourth day, disaster struck. They were navigating a narrow ledge when Eliza's horse lost its footing on the ice. She had a moment of weightless terror before Jonas's strong hand caught her arm, hauling her to safety as her mount scrambled for purchase. "Are you hurt?" He was off his horse in an instant, hands running over her, checking for injuries. "I'm fine," she gasped, though her ankle throbbed where she'd twisted it. The horse? Her mount had regained its footing but was favoring its right foreleg. Jonas examined it with gentle expertise. Strained, not broken, but he can't carry weight. They redistributed the supplies, and Eliza rode double with Jonas, his arms secure around her as they continued. Progress was even slower now, and her anxiety grew with each passing hour. "She's strong," Jonas said quietly as they made camp that night. "You get your strength from somewhere." 5 days into what should have been a 3-day journey, they were stopped by a more human obstacle. 3 men emerged from the trees, rifles leveled, road agents, preying on winter travelers. Well, the leader said, his face hidden by a scarf. "Travelers with full packs. How fortunate for us." "We have medical supplies," Jonas said calmly, though Eliza could feel the tension in his body. "For a dying woman. Take our money if you must, but leave us the medicines." Touching story. The man's eyes glittered coldly above the scarf. "But we'll take it all, unless—" His gaze shifted to Eliza. "The lady might earn some leniency. Pretty thing like that could be worth more than your supplies." Jonas went very still, and Eliza recognized the dangerous quiet that had preceded violence in the alley months ago. "That's not going to happen." 3 of us. 1 of you," the leader pointed out. "Not good odds. Friend." "No," Jonas agreed. "Not for you." What happened next was almost too fast to follow. Jonas moved with the fluid grace of a man who'd survived alone in hostile wilderness for years. His rifle spoke once, twice. The 3rd man tried to flee, but Jonas's thrown knife caught him in the shoulder, sending him sprawling. In moments, it was over. 1 dead, 2 wounded and fleeing. Jonas stood breathing hard, checking the loads in his rifle. "Are you—" Eliza began. "Fine, we need to move, now. They'll have friends." They rode through the night, Jonas pushing hard to put distance between them and potential pursuit. By dawn, they were descending into the foothills, and by noon of the 7th day, they finally saw the familiar outline of Fort Laramie. From there, they caught a stage heading east, though it meant leaving the horses behind. Jonas never complained about the expense or inconvenience, focused only on getting Eliza to her mother as quickly as possible. The rest of the journey passed in a blur of stages, trains, and finally, a hired carriage racing through the streets of Philadelphia. Eliza's aunt's house was a modest brownstone in a quiet neighborhood. The black crepe on the door made Eliza's heart stop. "No," she whispered. "Please, no." But her aunt, opening the door, quickly said, "She's still with us. Child, but barely. Come quickly." They were led to an upstairs room where Margaret lay propped on pillows, her breathing shallow and labored. But her eyes opened when Eliza entered, and a smile transformed her worn face. "My girl," she whispered. "You came." Eliza flew to her side, clasping her mother's frail hand. "Of course I came. Mother, I'm so sorry I wasn't here." "Hush." Margaret's eyes moved past her to Jonas, standing quietly by the door. "And this must be your husband." Jonas approached, taking off his hat. "Ma'am, it's an honor to finally meet you." Margaret studied him with eyes that, despite her weakness, Missed nothing. You love my daughter? More than life itself. Jonas said simply, Good. She patted the bed. Sit, both of you. I want to know you. Jonas, Eliza's letters were full of you, but letters can't capture a man's character. Over the next hours, as daylight faded and lamps were lit, they talked. Margaret, marshalling her strength, drew Jonas out about his life, his plans, his hopes for the future. She laughed weakly at his story of trying to teach Eliza to milk the cow, and tears slipped down her cheeks when he spoke of how Eliza had brought light back to his life. I worried, Margaret admitted as the evening wore on. When she left to go back to you, I worried I was sending her into a hard life. It is hard, Jonas agreed honestly. But we face it together. That makes all the difference. Margaret squeezed Eliza's hand. You found yourself a good man, my darling, like your father was. She turned to Jonas. You'll take care of her? Always. And any children you might have, you'll tell them about their grandmother? Every day, Eliza promised through her tears. Every single day. Margaret smiled. Then I can rest easy. She lived another 3 days. 3 precious days where Eliza rarely left her side, where they talked and laughed and cried together. Jonas was a steady presence, fetching what was needed, sitting with Margaret when Eliza needed to rest, reading to her from the Bible in his deep, soothing voice. On the last morning, Margaret woke unusually clear-eyed. The sun, she said. I'd like to see the sun once more. Jonas carried her, blanket-wrapped, to a chair by the window where the morning light streamed in. She sat between Jonas and Eliza, a hand in each of theirs. I'm not afraid, she said quietly. I've had a good life. I've seen my daughter grown and happy. What more could a mother ask? She looked at Eliza. You saved my life once, gave me these extra months. Don't grieve too hard, my darling. I'm ready. As the sun climbed higher, Margaret's breathing grew quieter. She spoke of Eliza's father, of how she could almost see him waiting for her. Her last words were, Be happy, my loves. Be so very happy. She passed as gently as she'd lived, with a soft sigh and a smile on her lips. The funeral was small but beautiful. Jonas, used to frontier ways, was surprised by the elaborate mourning customs of the East, but adapted with quiet grace. He stood solid as a mountain beside Eliza as she grieved, catching her when sobs shook her body, holding her through the long nights when loss sat heavy on her chest. She was at peace, he reminded her gently. She saw you happy and settled. That's all she wanted. They stayed another week, settling Margaret's few affairs, visiting her grave daily. Eliza's aunt tried to convince them to stay in Philadelphia, but both knew where they belonged. The mountains are my home now, Eliza said, standing at her mother's grave one last time. But I'll carry you with me always. The journey back to Wyoming was subdued but not sorrowful. Grief traveled with them, but so did the certainty of love. The love Margaret had shown in letting Eliza go. The love that waited in their mountain home. The love that would create new life from loss. As their wagon climbed the final ridge and their cabin came into view, Eliza felt something settle in her chest. Her mother was gone, but her blessing remained, and in this place of wild beauty and hard-won peace, that blessing would take root and grow. Welcome home, Jonas said softly. Eliza leaned against his shoulder, one hand touching the locket that now held 3 photographs, Sarah, Jacob, and Margaret. Yes, she said. Home. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold. Somewhere in that light, Eliza felt her mother's presence, warm and approving. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys. But tonight, she was where she belonged, with the man who'd shown her that love could bloom even in the harshest ground, if tended with faithful hands. Spring came to the mountains like a benediction, melting the snow and revealing the earth ready for new beginnings. Eliza stood in the doorway of their cabin, one hand resting on her swelling belly, watching Jonas work in the garden they'd planned together. The morning sun caught the silver threads that had begun to appear in his dark hair, marks of the difficult winter they'd weathered together. "You shouldn't be on your feet so much," Jonas called, straightening from his work. "The midwife said movement is good for me," Eliza replied, walking carefully to join him. "Besides, I wanted to see our first plantings." He wrapped an arm around her, his hand joining hers on her stomach. "Your mother would be proud. Remember how you told me about her herb garden? Rosemary for remembrance," Eliza murmured, looking at the small shoots already pushing through the dark soil. She always said a garden was hope made visible. The baby kicked, and Jonas's face lit up with wonder, as it did every time. They discovered the pregnancy shortly after returning from Philadelphia, a bittersweet gift in the wake of loss. Now, with summer approaching, their child would soon enter the world. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Eliza worked on a tiny gown while Jonas carved a cradle from pine. They developed these quiet rhythms, finding peace in shared purpose. The ghosts that had once haunted this cabin, Sarah and Jacob, felt like gentle presences now, blessing rather than burdening. "I've been thinking about names," Eliza said. "If it's a girl, Margaret," Jonas finished. "For your mother," she smiled, touched that he'd been thinking the same. "And if it's a boy?" Jonas was quiet for a moment, his hands stilling on the wood. "Not Jacob. That name belongs to him alone, but maybe Thomas? After your father." Tears pricked her eyes. "He'd have liked you so much." As her time grew near, Jonas became increasingly protective. He'd arranged for Mrs. Weber, the German midwife from town, to come stay with them for the final weeks. The practical woman arrived with a bag of herbs and a no-nonsense manner that reminded Eliza achingly of her mother. "First baby, Mrs.?" Weber asked, examining Eliza with experienced hands. "Everything looks good. Strong heartbeat. Baby's positioned well." The pains began on a clear morning in early July. Eliza had risen to start breakfast when the first wave hit, stealing her breath. Jonas was at her side instantly. "Is it? I think so," she gasped. What followed were the longest hours of both their lives. Jonas, who'd faced down bears and bandits without flinching, was white-faced with worry. Mrs. Weber banished him from the bedroom repeatedly, only to have him reappear moments later. "Men," she muttered, "useless as teats on a bull during birthing." But when Eliza cried out during a particularly hard pain, she relented. "Fine. Hold her hand. But if you faint, I'm stepping over you." Jonas didn't faint. He stayed rock steady, letting Eliza grip his hand hard enough to leave bruises, whispering encouragement, wiping the sweat from her brow, and when, as the sun set behind the mountains, their daughter entered the world with a lusty cry, he wept unashamedly. "Margaret Sarah McGrath," Eliza whispered, cradling the tiny, perfect form. "Hello, little one." The baby had Jonas's dark hair, but Eliza's delicate features. She gazed up at them with unfocused eyes, already seeming to study the world she'd entered. "She's beautiful," Jonas breathed, touching the baby's cheek with one gentle finger. Just like her mother. As Eliza recovered, life settled into new patterns. Margaret, Maggie, as she quickly became, was a good baby, alert and curious. Jonas was endlessly patient with her, carrying her around the homestead, explaining everything as if she could understand. "That's where we'll build your own room when you're bigger," he'd say. "And there's where your mama wants to plant apple trees. You'll be able to climb them someday." One evening, as autumn painted the aspens gold, they climbed to the meadow above Sarah and Jacob's graves. It had become their tradition to visit monthly, and today they brought Maggie for the first time. "This is your brother and sister," Eliza said softly, kneeling by the stones. "They're watching over you, just like my mama is." Jonas stood behind them, his hands on Eliza's shoulders. "Our family," he said simply. "All of us." As winter approached again, they were better prepared. The root cellar was full, wood stacked high, the animals secure. When the first snows came, they were ready. One night, As blizzard winds howled outside, they lay in bed with Maggie sleeping between them. The baby made soft sounds in her sleep, and Eliza traced her tiny features by the light of the dying fire. "Do you ever think about how strange it all was?" she asked quietly. "How we found each other?" Every day, Jonas shifted to look at her over their daughter's head. "If you hadn't been desperate enough to take that bargain, if I hadn't been lonely enough to make it, if the storm hadn't trapped us together, we might never have known," Eliza finished. "But we did." He reached over to touch her cheek. "And now look what we've built from it." She thought about that first night, how she'd come prepared to sacrifice everything for duty, how instead she'd found love in the most unexpected place. The money that had saved her mother's life had been important, yes, but the connection forged in those 3 days, that had saved her own life in ways she was still discovering. "I love you," she said, words that still felt like a miracle to speak aloud. "And I love you," he replied. "Both of you, all of us." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside their mountain home, warmth and love held sway. The bargain that had brought them together was long complete, but the life they'd built from it grew stronger with each passing season. In the spring, Eliza would plant her mother's garden in earnest. Jonas would add the promised room to the cabin. Maggie would take her first steps on the same floor where her parents had first danced around their attraction. And in time, other children would join her, filling the once lonely cabin with laughter and chaos and love. But for now, in this perfect moment, they were complete, a family forged from loss and found in the most unlikely circumstances. The mountains stood eternal around them, witnesses to a love story that had begun with a desperate bargain and transformed into something as enduring as the peaks themselves. As Maggie stirred and Eliza moved to nurse her, Jonas lit a candle, the warm glow pushing back the darkness. In that light, the locket on the bedside table gleamed, holding its precious photographs, preserving memory while life moved ever forward. "To think," Eliza murmured as the baby settled back to sleep. "It all started with $300 and a snowstorm. Best investment I ever made," Jonas said, pulling them both close. And in the warmth of their bed, surrounded by love and possibility, Eliza knew he was right. Some prices were too high to pay, but some chances were too precious to miss, and sometimes, just sometimes, what began as sacrifice became salvation. The wind died down, leaving peaceful silence. Stars appeared between the breaking clouds, and in a cabin where loneliness had once echoed, 3 hearts beat in harmony, proof that love could bloom anywhere, if given courage enough to try. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I'd love to know where in the world you're enjoying this tale. Please share in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and let me know your thoughts on Eliza and Jonas's journey. Did their unexpected love story touch your heart? What was your favorite moment? Your feedback means everything, and I can't wait to connect with fellow readers from around the globe.